Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar about updates to the Active Transportation Cycle 7. My name is Jonathan Matz. I'm California's Senior Policy Manager here at the Safe Routes Partnership. And we usually do a webinar like this with every ATP cycle, sort of going over changes in guidelines and application questions and the like. Wanted to focus particularly on this year on some changes that we were pushing for a couple of years, and are very grateful to the Transportation Commission for having accepted, and changes made possible by a shift in format, which we'll be talking about, or a shift in application platform, I guess is the best way to say it, that we'll be speaking of momentarily. And those are some additional pop-out questions specifically about non-infrastructure components within combined infrastructure, non-infrastructure applications. I'm pleased to have a guest who I'll be introducing in just a second, who's going to be speaking about, who's going to be helping me speak about those, and also about other changes to the application while we're at it. So just a little bit about us. I'm sure we've worked with many participants here, but for those of us who are new to us, the Safe Routes Partnership is a national organization. We advance safe walking and biking and rolling generally to and from schools, parks, with a focus particularly on improving the wealth and well-being of children of all races, income levels, and abilities, and believe that by doing so, we foster the creation of healthy communities for everyone. We have been running webinars about the Active Transportation Program since, I believe, cycle 5 maybe, with the goal of helping first-time applicants, under-resourced applicants who have applied previously but been unsuccessful, focusing on various aspects of the application process, and trying to increase the chances of submitting a competitive application. We also, as I mentioned before earlier, usually try to do at least one of these webinars every cycle out of 2 or 3 that are just kind of focuses on changes that might be a little bit under the radar, especially for return applicants. We have published a guide to the ATP, first published in 2018 and updated a couple years ago. The link will be there, and we'll probably be updating it a 3rd time after this cycle to take into account a lot of the changes that we'll be talking about today. So that'll come sometime in the fall. A little bit about cycle 7. And just kind of our goals today, as I mentioned before, focusing on the changes in the guidelines, and zeroing in most specifically on the combined infrastructure and non-infrastructure applicants. We'll also talk about some new federal disadvantaged communities metrics, which are also available for use to qualify as a DAC on statewide points. And when it might be advantageous to use those metrics for to qualify your community. I wanted to introduce now my co-presenter, Beverly Newman Burkhardt, who's Assistant Deputy Director of the Active Transportation Program at the CTC. I put a little placeholder here on purpose for ATP funding in cycle 7. Just because this question is still, to my knowledge, at least, being negotiated in the legislature and with the governor's office. And a reminder to advocate with your legislators, whatever community you are, to restore the full funding level of the ATP, and to reject the proposed cuts that have been made to the program. So a little bit of background, kind of maybe a prerequisite condition change in the application process, which has made possible these, at least some of these substance changes that we'll be talking about. As many of you may know, especially if you've already started your application process, the ATP has gone has made a transition to an online web-based application after having used PDFs in previous cycles that would essentially send themselves to an FTP server. So there is now a much more user-friendly and collaborative system called Submittable. And the link to it is right there. You can get your application going. CTC has also done a webinar explaining how to use it. And I create a little easy to remember bit.ly link for it right there, as well as a link to the slides for it. These links, you can write them down, but the slides that we're using right now are also going to be made available to you after this webinar. So rest assured, you'll be able to find your way to that soon. But it was actually by making this transition to these web-based forms that the changes or the additional prompts for non-infrastructure applications became much more technically feasible than they would have been if we'd remained in the previous application format. So I'll explain a little bit of the reasoning why we and some other advocates pushed for, if not a new application type for combined infrastructure, non-infrastructure projects, some sort of additional questions focused on the non-infrastructure component. As participants of this or attendees of this webinar may know from previous cycles, if your agency was submitting an application in the ATP that combined both proposed infrastructure improvements and educational encouragement programs known as a non-infrastructure component as one full application, which is a best practice that we heartily recommend and that has proven repeatedly to significantly improve chances of success. Nevertheless, you were an applicant was compelled to use just the standard infrastructure form and try to squeeze in, we thought, in a rather constrained manner, additional information about the non-infrastructure components with not as much guidance as we thought would have been helpful for how to talk about those components, and similarly not as much guidance for evaluators in terms of really considering that half of the application, that aspect of the application, and really being able to score that part of the application in as comprehensively as we're given the opportunity to score an infrastructure application. So we pushed, we asked the California Transportation Commission over a couple of years when the time would be right to make some modifications, and thankfully with the adoption of Submittable, we're now able to do that. So what we're going to do in this webinar is I'm going to run through essentially the relatively minor and not particularly cumbersome prompts that have been added to combined infrastructure and non-infrastructure applications, going through it and sort of where to be on the lookout for them in each infrastructure category. And then I'm going to be turning over to Beverly, who's going to talk a little bit about how sort of on the evaluation side, they're going to be looked at, how applicants should consider describing those aspects of the programs and writing about their contribution to the overall project. So first, what I'll do is I'll go over prompts that have been added first for all infrastructure applications, the small, medium, and large, and then there's some that have been added only to the medium and large, and then some only to the large. So I'll go over them that way. That's the way that seemed most intuitive to me. So in Part B, Question 1, in the Statement of Need, Question 1, Part C, addressing the need. Whereas you may be familiar, there's after being invited to describe the particular public health and quality of life challenges that your community experiences, and then how the proposed infrastructure improvements will address those specific challenges. We have the prompt describe how non-infrastructure events and programs will be targeted towards the disadvantaged community whom the project benefits. So really giving you extra space to fill out how encouragement and education is going to play a role, not just the building of facilities beyond there. Further down in question 2, part B, excuse me, sorry. We have it'll be written, describe the non-infrastructure program, the population it will serve, and how the program will use education and encouragement to the needs that you've identified already in part A. So again, you should expect to write a separate response to that in previous applications. It's just been suggested as a kind of little tack on within the main text box that you make sure to address that. But here we really want to give a dedicated space for it. And then finally, in part B, question 3, what's known as what we refer to as the sort of traffic safety part of the application. This is where you're prompted to upload your TIMS maps and collision data, and speak about how the proposed improvements will address whatever safety issues have been identified in the corridor or intersections of question. Again, another call out specifically for the non-infrastructure program. How is that going to address all the safety issues you mentioned in part A? So there will be additional word space to do that, whereas in the past it was it could be easy to overlook including that in your answer for that. So those are all additions that you'll see whether or not you do small, medium, or large infrastructure applications. If you're doing a medium or a large, in part B, question 4, you'll see the text above, and the text above. I should clarify. Should mostly be familiar to you, but you'll see in bold and italics an addition that's made for combined infrastructure, non-infrastructure project. This is discussing the public engagement efforts. Describe specifically how that aspect has been addressed in the community. So, for example, if you're doing a Safe Routes to School project that's going to be making improvements around 1 or 2 schools, and you've had some community meetings and maybe even school meetings in which various designs have been shared with the community, with the opportunity for community members to ask for adjustments, etc. Here we're really looking at asking the extent to which the proposed programs that you've done have really been talked about at the school, and the extent to which you've already engaged with the parent and student and teacher population at the school about those programs before submitting a proposal to fund them. In question 5, also of part B, you'll see more bold and italics, additional text here. Combined infrastructure and non-infrastructure projects should address both infrastructure and non-infrastructure elements. So in this question about what's innovative, and I forgot to mention before, this is a question unique to the large infrastructure application, but we really want to encourage applicants to think not just about innovative and new features in the built environment that might never have been experienced before in your community, but also what are some new aspects of programs that even community members or schools that are familiar generally with Safe Routes to School programming, what are some new elements of this that will be innovative and seen as new and exciting by the community. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Beverly, if you're ready, to go through sort of on the evaluator's end how answers to these will be considered.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jonathan. Really happy to be here today. I really like collaborating with Jonathan on these webinars, so thanks for inviting me today. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Oh, okay. I'm going to stop sharing your screen. And- Okay, you guys can see my PowerPoint, right? Okay, perfect. All right, so hi everyone. So I'm going to kind of go through the additions to the scoring rubric. Related to the new non-infrastructure prompts and the combination applications. And the first thing I wanted to do is just quickly, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with our scoring rubrics. So I just wanted to orient everyone to our scoring rubrics because I'm going to be like kind of referencing things as I go through, and I don't want people to be lost. So um, we have 5 scoring rubrics, and 3 of those scoring rubrics are for infrastructure projects. And the combination application, so the infrastructure, non-infrastructure application, those use the applicable infrastructure scoring rubric. So that means if your project falls into a medium infrastructure, non-infrastructure project, you would use the medium scoring rubric. And so in each scoring rubric, it's kind of divided by question. And at the beginning, so it'll be like question 1 is disadvantaged communities, question 2 is increasing walking and biking, and then under each of those questions, there's kind of different sections. And part of that is just the kind of overview of the question. So this is kind of just a repeat of what's in the application. I picked random parts of the scoring rubric for these screenshots, whatever really fit on my screen the best. So don't pay too much attention to the text. But so at the beginning, it just shows you what the question is in the application, if there's multiple parts. And then after that, there's usually something that says special instructions and expectations for evaluators. And I will talk more about this throughout this, but this is really a really great part of the scoring rubric to look at because usually it provides more detail on things that you can be talking about in your narrative. It says special instructions and expectations for evaluators, but it could just say like special hints for applicants as well, because it's really providing you like some like prompts and things that you could be thinking about as you're putting together this response. And then there is a kind of the scoring table where you see the different tiers of points that you can get. Again, I just picked a random one from the scoring rubric, but generally the tiers are kind of going, they're saying, did you clearly and convincingly demonstrate these different things? And if you clearly and convincingly demonstrate it, then you get full points. If you're like sufficiently demonstrating it, or if you adequately, sometimes it says adequately in the scoring rubric, depending on which question you're on, you might get like the next tier level. If you know you're not uh, demonstrating it very well, maybe you'd get the next level down. And then if you don't demonstrate whatever it's looking for at all, you get the kind of maybe no points in that section. I will say it's pretty hard to get 0 points in the application if you like put an answer there, because you know hopefully your response is demonstrating something. So, but yeah, so it's kind of an overview of the scoring rubric. Just a few things. The scoring rubric is really your #1 resource and best friend while you're writing your application. There's so much detail in the scoring rubric. It kind of tells you what the evaluators are looking for. It gives you like prompts and things you can discuss. So please, please, please use the scoring rubrics as you are filling out your application. And we were really happy to work with Jonathan and a group, a small group of other partners on these changes, because something that we've noticed is that our applicants aren't really, for these combination applications, they're not really highlighting their non-infrastructure elements as much as they could be. And having a non-infrastructure element to your project should, you know, if it complements your project well, like it could it could help you like boost your ability to demonstrate like the benefits of your infrastructure element. So kind of the two elements are complementing each other, but um, we just noticed that our applicants really weren't describing their non-infrastructure elements very well, and it was kind of hurting their application. So we were really excited to implement these changes. Okay, So I'll just kind of go through, Jonathan went through all the different questions, so I'll go through all the different parts of the scoring rubric for each question. So the disadvantaged communities question is generally question 1 in all of the applications. And we added a question asking applicants to explain how non-infrastructure events and programs will be targeted towards the disadvantaged community that they benefit. So in the special instructions and expectations for evaluators of this in the scoring rubric, so in that section of this question, we've added a little bit more detail. So this should include discussions of strategies that will be used to ensure that the non-infrastructure programming is easily accessible to the disadvantaged community and relevant to their needs. And then there's some example of that: development of community relevant content, choice of venue, methods used to promote the program, materials in appropriate languages, and so on. So here, so something I should have started out with is when you look at the scoring like tiers in the table, it's pretty clear like what we're looking for, but it's also like, you know, leaving some like what is clearly and convincingly, like what does that mean? Like how do I get those full points? So something to remember as you're developing your responses is to provide as much detail as possible. So your evaluator probably won't be familiar with your community or your project. And so you're really trying to like capture the story in your narrative of your project, and you're really trying to provide them as much detail as possible. So you should be providing details about how you will make like your non-infrastructure program as easy as possible for your disadvantaged community members to participate. So maybe that includes providing food or providing childcare, or maybe you need to provide transit passes to help them get there, to get to the location of your non-infrastructure programming. And then, you know, are you like, where will you be holding these events, and are they being held in relevant locations for your disadvantaged community? So maybe, you know, this is Safe Routes Partnership, so obviously having them at this school would be like would be a very relevant location, but maybe there's some non-infrastructure elements that aren't targeted just towards children or students. So maybe you hold them at the community center or a place of worship that's relevant to the community. Obviously, you know your community best, so just kind of explain like why you chose that location. And then also thinking about like the materials that you're providing for your participants. So it says on here appropriate languages. So if there's another dominant language in your community, if you're providing materials for those as individuals, or if you're making sure that your materials or your programming is accessible for people with disabilities. Maybe you have to account for different reading levels in your materials, or account for, you know, people's familiarity with technology in your materials. So those are just some things to kind of think about and to include in this narrative. Like that, those kinds of details are definitely appropriate for the application, and they kind of provide that story that helps evaluators see that you're clearly and convincingly describing it. Okay, so then this is the language. So the language in bold underline right here, actually that might just be underline, not bold. So that is the language that was added to the scoring rubric related to the non-infrastructure element of the project. And this is again in the disadvantaged community section. And this is the scoring table, but you'll see that it's only kind of like the top range. The same language was added to all the other ranges of the scoring rubric. It's just for ease, so you don't have to read it over and over again. So the language that was added was for combined I&I projects or infrastructure / non-infrastructure projects, how the non-infrastructure events and programs will be targeted towards the disadvantaged community. So are you clearly and convincingly telling the evaluators how you're doing this? So, you know, in that special instructions for evaluators section, it kind of gives you some ideas on how you could clearly and convincingly demonstrate this. but also that list there is not exhaustive. So if you have other ideas of how you can kind of describe your non-infrastructure program and how it targets the disadvantaged community, please include those details. Okay, so, I just wanted to show you that for most of the scoring tables in the application, they actually look really similar throughout the different project sizes. So small looks really similar to medium, looks really similar to large. The two questions where they're a little bit more different is the disadvantaged communities question and the public participation and planning question. So in disadvantaged communities, on the screen, it's for the medium and large scoring rubrics. And it's honestly kind of the same detail that's in the small scoring rubric. It's just broken down a little bit more and it kind of fleshes it out a little bit more. But it's the same language that was added to the scoring rubric for the medium and large. Okay, so then in in all of the combination applications, question 2 is the potential to increase walking and biking. And as commission staff, we often refer to this as the need question, just shorthand, because in part A of this question, you're really describing like why your project is needed. So the new question that we added asks the applicants to describe how the non-infrastructure programming will address the needs identified in Part A. So in Part A of this question, you're really talking about why does your community need this project in terms of like connectivity. So like where are the gaps in connectivity, mobility. So what kind of mobility challenges is your community facing? And then health. So what are the community specific health challenges that people are facing? And then, you're supposed to talk about things like mode shift in this question as well. So that's part A of the question. And then part B is basically, hey, how is your project going to identify, how is your project going to address the needs identified in part A? So the needs that you just described, what is your project going to do? So for this, we're asking like, hey, like you just talked about like what your infrastructure project's going to do, but we also want to know what your non-infrastructure programs are going to do to address those needs. So, and in the special instructions and expectations for evaluator section, we kind of break down a few things that you can talk about. So how your program will provide new skills and familiarity to the community. So, new skills could be like, you're doing some sort of skills class for kids at schools, or maybe you're doing a bike bus to school, something like that. So how is that providing new skills? Familiarity could also be like, it could be a bike bus, there could be existing infrastructure there that you're helping kids like navigate through your programs. And so we also want to see how you're inducing mode shifts, how you're enhancing connectivity, mobility, and health. That's an important one, and how you're introducing the community to new and existing improvements. So just as an example here, you could, let's just take the example of like a bike bus. Maybe in terms of new skills, it's helping kids develop new skills as they're riding their bikes with like a trusted person who's guiding them to school. It also could, induce mode shift because parents are more comfortable with their kids riding to school in this group. And it also could enhance connectivity because not only are they able to get to school, but they can also go to their after school activities. Maybe they have, there's like a Boys and Girls Club down the street, or maybe there's, a sports complex nearby or a park where there's a lot of sports practices. Mobility, so you could talk about how it's enhancing the mobility of the family because, suddenly the kids are able to use this program to get to school. And so there's like more like freedom and mobility for the whole family. And then health, whatever health challenges the community is facing, you can talk about like how this program will help that, maybe even just getting the kids on bikes every day to get to school together. could address some of these health issues. And then again, this is the scoring table. And this one is really similar in each of the applications, or in each of the scoring rubrics, I'm sorry. So for each size, small, medium, and large, it's pretty similar. And you can see over here, there's different point levels for whatever application you're using, but this is the language we added here. So you need to clearly and convincingly demonstrate these things up here, but you also need to demonstrate that the non-infrastructure program will provide new skills and familiarity to the community. Okay, and then there's a safety question. This is usually question 3 of the application. So in the special instructions and expectations for evaluators, it's saying evaluators should evaluate the extent to which the non-infrastructure program will address the safety concerns outlined in Part A by encouraging safe behaviors, educating users about safety hazards, and/or complementing infrastructure improvements. So this is in Part B of this question. So in Part A of the safety question, you are demonstrating kind of the safety issues in your community, and this can be done through collision data. Sometimes it's using like crowdsourced information like surveys or maps of near misses. And then you're providing a narrative on these safety issues. So, what's causing these collisions or what's causing these near misses? And in Part A, you should really be, you should talk about any safety issues that you've witnessed in your community. I think safe routes to school projects are always good to demonstrate issues, because I think there's usually a lot of like information from the community about safety challenges around schools. I think that's like a huge concern for a lot of members of the community. So I think you can make like a really powerful and compelling case here. So this is in Part B. So what is your non-infrastructure program going to do, your education encouragement program going to do to address those safety issues that you saw, that you kind of detailed in Part A? So for this, maybe, you've seen like unsafe behaviors that kids have been doing, or maybe you've seen kids who don't know how to like navigate an intersection, and you're going to do like some skills class to specifically address like how to navigate this intersection. And maybe along with that, you're also implementing infrastructure improvements that make that intersection safer. So you can talk about that as well, and how it's like how the infrastructure and the non-infrastructure elements are complementing each other. So really here, make sure that what you're saying in this section is really being tied back to Part A. So those things that you're saying in Part A, where you're describing the safety hazards, like really reference that directly and talk about how your programs will address those issues. Okay. And then this is the scoring table. So to get full points, the evaluators will be looking about how your proposed non-infrastructure programming will address the safety needs discussed in Part A by encouraging safe behaviors, educating users on safety hazards, and/or complementing infrastructure improvements. So pretty much the same format as the other questions, and then that's replicated throughout the scoring table, that language. Okay, public participation and planning. So we didn't actually include any specific notes on the new question or the new language for non-infrastructure, for the non-infrastructure prompts. In the scoring rubric, in the special instructions for evaluators section. However, you can certainly reference the kind of language that's already in the special instructions related to the infrastructure. So really in this section, in order to get these kind of full points, like you should be talking about how your non-infrastructure program was co-developed with community input, Maybe you developed it in collaboration with a community-based organization or a school. You should talk about how you obtained any input on the non-infrastructure program, and you can specifically talk about any input you received, especially input that that you implemented as part of your project. So maybe you got input from the parent community about a certain safety issue or about a certain concern. Like maybe they said like, you heard a lot of input about, we don't feel safe like letting our kids ride their bikes to school, and like this is how like your program is going to address that input specifically. And then also, you can also talk about how you ensured that your target audience for the non-infrastructure element was engaged in the program, in the development of the program. So maybe your project is part of a larger infrastructure project that's not necessarily targeted at schools, but maybe your non-infrastructure element is targeted at schools. So how did you kind of engage that subset of the population on the development of your program? Your overall, for your infrastructure project, your overall audience was everyone in the community, but for this non-infrastructure element, you really wanted to engage that school population. So how did you do that, and like how did you reach them? Or maybe it's like a specific disadvantaged community within that that school population. Yep, so this is the scoring table. This is actually the scoring table for the small application. For the medium and large, because it's broken out a little bit differently, it looks a little different, but it's the same language that was, added to each tier of the scoring rubric. And then context sensitivity and innovation. So for this, again, there's not any notes in the special instructions for evaluators that are specific to the non-infrastructure element, but there are notes about kind of the project overall. So in this section, you should be talking about why your non-infrastructure programming is innovative. And innovative can mean different things for different communities, so that's something to remember. This may be the first time you've ever implemented an education program in schools in your community, like targeted at active transportation. That can be innovative. Or maybe it's something like, you're doing some like student-led elements as part of your non-infrastructure programming. And so, that can also be really innovative. So really here, what you need to remember is that innovative can mean something different for each community, and it's really up to you to just, describe why it's innovative for your community. Also okay if you didn't choose any innovative elements. Maybe your community is really experienced in implementing programs like this, and you guys already have kind of your established best practices that work in your community. So in that case, describe that here and describe like, hey, we didn't use any innovative elements because we already have this like established way of doing things that's really meeting the needs of our community and meeting the needs of our audience, and it's really kind of fitting in with the context of what our community needs and what our schools need if you're doing a school program. Yep, so this is what the scoring table looks like, and then the language we added is the applicant included and or considered innovative elements in the non-infrastructure programming. Again, that language could, if you didn't include any elements, it's okay. You can talk about whether you considered it and why you didn't pick them, and then tell them what you're doing instead, like best practices. And then transformative projects. So Jonathan, I don't actually think you included this one in your slide. Maybe you did. I'm not sure.
I may have overlooked it.
That's okay, because it was actually already in the application.
Okay.
So I wasn't sure if you included it, because it was actually already like listed in the application as something that you should discuss.
Yeah, it's now that you're mentioning it, I'm pretty sure that's why I left it out, but thanks for catching it anyways.
No, I didn't want to like call you. I just, in case people were confused. Okay, so in the large infrastructure application, there is a question on transformative projects. So basically how your project is transformative in nature. And in that question, in the question, it's always asked if you have a non-infrastructure program, how is it like contributing to the transformative nature of the project? And so that actually wasn't in the scoring rubric before, so we added this language here. The non-infrastructure program will contribute to the transformative nature of the project. And for this, there's lots of ways that you can handle this, but I personally would suggest kind of talking about how your infrastructure and non-infrastructure programs are complementing each other to make whatever you're doing even more transformative. So if you're connecting your project to affordable housing, and maybe so there's going to be some new bikeways or sidewalks that go to affordable housing, and or maybe you're targeting your non-infrastructure programs at those at that neighborhood. Or maybe you're developing a new sidewalk network, and you're going to kind of tie in a non-infrastructure program to help kids navigate those sidewalks to get to school. Or maybe you're doing, related to like projects or policies or ordinances. Maybe there's like or even like a school policy that you can kind of tie in about like safe routes to school or walk to school days or something that you can tie into this question. So really like focus on how it's complementing the infrastructure project and also how the infrastructure project is complementing the non-infrastructure element. Okay, so that's all I had for the scoring for the non-infrastructure infrastructure element of the application and scoring rubrics. Jonathan, did you want me to jump into these new disadvantaged community identifiers?
That would be great. Yeah, why don't we go and do that? We've already answered a couple questions in the Q&A, so maybe we can hold all questions about the previous part and this until the very end. So
okay, great. I'll try to kind of go through these quickly so there's plenty of time for questions. Okay, so if you were following along with our workshops this year, you'll know that we added 2 disadvantaged community identifiers. They're not actually on this list on the screen. I should have added them, but I'll go over them in a second. But I just want to be clear up front that the 2 new identifiers are not replacing any of the existing identifiers. They are in addition to the existing identifiers. So those are listed on the screen. So you can still use any of those. You don't need to switch to these new identifiers if you don't want to. Okay. So the first one that we added was the US DOT Equitable Transportation Community Explorer. This is a web tool that has a map, and it kind of shows you the cumulative burdens that your community is facing. And I'll kind of go over those burdens in a second. And these burdens are specifically kind of related to transportation. It is a transportation tool. And then, there are 2 different results. If you go to the tool, they're the national results. Those compare census tracts on a national level. So it compares, your census tract in California that you live in to every other census tract in the country. And there are also state results, which are comparing the census tracts within a state. So your census tract that you live in compared to every other census tract in the state. The commission is using the state results. If you are going to use this metric to identify your disadvantaged community, make sure that you are using the state results, not the national results. And the state results tend to be better for everyone anyway, so hopefully you would use this anyway, just because California tends to do better in a lot of these metrics than a lot of other places in the country. Okay, so this tool measures transportation insecurity, so it's looking at things like access and cost burden. It looks at climate and disaster risk. So it looks at things like extreme weather, like heat, and sea level rise. It looks at environmental burden, so things like pollution. It looks at health vulnerability. So these are things, looking at the things like asthma and cancer and high blood pressure and diabetes. And then it also looks at social vulnerability. And that is things like poverty levels, unemployment rates, English proficiency. There's a whole list of things. So if you go to their website, you can actually download kind of an info sheet that shows you all of the different things that go into calculating your final index score, which is what we use in our program. Basically, your score for each indicator is there are all of these different components under each indicator. They're summed, and then everything is percentile ranked to get you a final index score. So this is what our guidelines say, like how we'll score this. You can download, from our application, the data is linked, so you can download the spreadsheet for this and see your final index score. And this is really similar to the structure of some of our other disadvantaged community tools. So we use like the top 10% most disadvantaged. We do the same thing for the CalEnviroscreen and for Healthy Places Index. So you'll just be like looking at your score and kind of figuring out where your census tract falls. And then this is just showing you how it's actually scored. We use a weighted average. So we're taking into account all of the final index scores for every census tract in your project. And with the it accounts for population. So it kind of gives you a weighted average final index score so you can figure out your severity score. And then we're also using the climate and economic justice screening tool. That's the second tool that we added. This was released by the federal government as part of Justice 40 to help identify disadvantaged communities. So it's, again, a national tool. And this one is a little bit different in terms of there are different indicators, and you only have to meet one of the indicators in order to be considered disadvantaged. So this looks at climate change. So that's looking at like flood risk and wildfire risk. It looks at health. So again, like things like asthma. It looks at legacy pollution, which is like abandoned mines. I don't actually think that California is listed as having any abandoned mines in this tool. I'm not sure if that's like true, but for the threshold for this tool, California, like this one, California doesn't do very well. Water and wastewater, so that's looking at like wastewater discharge and leaking underwater storage tanks. It looks at tribal lands. So tribal lands are automatically kind of considered disadvantaged under this tool. Although with our program, if your project is on tribal lands, you would automatically get full points anyway. It looks at energy costs. So that's mainly looking at energy, and that's mainly looking at energy cost. Housing. This is looking at like housing costs, but this also looks at historic redlining, so historic underinvestment due to redlining, which is a really cool thing that we are finally capturing in the program. It wasn't captured under any of our other tools before. And then transportation, so that's mainly like transportation, pollution and barriers. And then workforce development is like kind of related to the social indicator on the last tool, so that's like poverty and unemployment. And it also looks at neighboring disadvantaged communities based on like a threshold of the poverty rate in that census tract related to if the rest of the census tracts around it are disadvantaged. For this one, we're scoring it. So because it's different than our other tools, we had to come up with a different scoring structure, but we're basically counting the number of categories that that each census tract qualifies under. So each of these categories listed on this screen, like if you qualify under 4 of these, we would like count it here, and then we score it like this, again, a weighted average. So this census tract qualified under 6. This one's qualified under 3. and we account for a population when we calculate the weighted average. And you do not have to calculate the weighted average in the application. It does it for you. Okay, I think that's it. And I think we have 10 minutes left.
Thank you so much, Beverly. I'm just going to put up here how you can get in touch with us here at the partnership for follow-up questions. Thank you for that overview. I definitely need to dig into those DAC metrics more, kind of play around and see how they compare with HPI and CES on any given tracks. Kind of curious to see the breakdown of that. And thank you so much, Beverly, as well, for kind of a question by question overview on the rubrics of that. We hope, particularly for if you're joining us and you're writing or planning to write the non-infrastructure component for an application, or if you're writing the infrastructure side and want to make sure that this part is addressed well. We hope that was informative. Just wanted to see if there are any questions before we break that either Beverly or I might be able to answer. I know we already did a couple as we're going through, or anything else. I'm not seeing anything, so I think we'll be able to wrap up. Once again, thanks for joining us. Any follow-up questions, please get in touch with us in the slides. And recording this webinar will be made available within a couple days. So please do make sure that any partners who are working on either side of the application that you're working with get a chance to read through. Well, that will break. Please again make sure that you're speaking with your legislators, excuse me, about ATP funding. Really very critical in this time. Oh, I'm saying one thing in the chat here. Oh, and with that, we'll say have a great afternoon. You can get 9 minutes back of your time. Thanks everybody, and thanks Beverly.
Thank
And Courtney.
you. Thanks everyone.